My name is Maya Collins, and for most of my life, I believed that family was unshakable, that no matter how twisted things became, there would always be a hand reaching for you at the end of the day. I grew up in Chicago, Illinois, in a narrow two-story brick house with blue shutters and a maple tree that turned gold every autumn. My parents, Laura and David Collins, bought it for $980,000 during the peak of the housing market, and though it strained their savings, it was the house my mother had dreamed of since college. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with old townhomes, each with its own kind of charm. Ours had a small attic I turned into my studio. I painted the walls a cool gray, strung warm fairy lights across the window, and spent nights sketching city skylines. To me, that house wasn't just a structure, it was our history. Every corner held echoes of birthdays, laughter, and Sunday dinners that stretched too long. But my sister Brianna never saw it that way. To her, the house was an asset, not a home, a line on a balance sheet rather than a place that kept our lives together. Brianna was 3 years younger, ambitious, and sharp in ways that made people uneasy. She worked in finance downtown, drove a Mercedes she couldn't really afford, and treated success as a sport. I used to admire her confidence until I realized it was built on taking from others, slowly, cleverly, without leaving fingerprints. My parents were aging and growing weary of managing their bills, so when Brianna offered to handle their accounts, they said yes. I was too busy managing project deadlines at my design firm near the river to notice how much ground she was quietly claiming. It started small. She'd intercept the mail, claiming she needed to review bank statements before showing them to Dad. She'd rewrite reminders on the family whiteboard, replacing grocery lists with notes like, "Call advisor about refinancing." When I questioned her, she laughed it off, saying, "Relax, Maya. I'm just trying to help." My parents nodded along, grateful for her organization. I wanted to believe her intentions were pure. That illusion broke on a cold January evening. The city had been hit by a blizzard, and I trudged home through the snow with 2 bags of groceries, cutting into my fingers. When I reached our porch, I slipped the key into the lock, and it wouldn't turn. I tried again, jiggling it, pressing harder. Nothing. I glanced at the frosted windows. The lights were on inside. I knocked. After a pause, the door opened, and Brianna stood there, her arms folded and her lips pressed into a thin smile. "Maya," she said smoothly, "you shouldn't just show up anymore. Things are a little different now." I blinked, confused. "What are you talking about? Why doesn't my key work?" Behind her, I saw my parents standing near the staircase. My mother's eyes darted between us, filled with guilt. My father looked smaller somehow, tired. Brianna sighed, stepping into the doorway like she owned it. "They've decided it's best if you move out," she said. "You've been a little controlling lately, always questioning their choices. It's stressing them out." "What choices?" I demanded. My voice cracked in the cold air. "Financial ones," she said simply, her tone practiced and calm. "You don't need to worry about it anymore. I'm taking care of everything." She handed me an envelope. Inside was a typed letter, and signed, stating that my parents no longer wanted me living in the house and asking me to vacate immediately. My mother whispered my name, but Brianna silenced her with a look. It felt like a bad dream, the kind where your voice doesn't work when you scream. I stood there with snow melting on my coat, while Brianna's smile widened just enough to make my stomach twist. I begged my parents to let me pack my things. My father nodded weakly, but Brianna cut in, saying, "No need to drag it out. You can take a few essentials. We'll ship the rest." She handed me a small cardboard box, barely big enough for a few clothes, and shut the door before I could reply. The click of the lock sounded final, like a nail in a coffin. I stood on the porch for a long time before I finally walked away. I ended up in a budget hotel off Interstate 90. The lobby smelled like burnt coffee and disinfectant. I paid $96 for the night and sat on the edge of the bed with my coat still on, staring at the pale wallpaper. My phone buzzed once, an automated bank alert. The joint account my parents used for utilities had been closed. I checked another account I sometimes used to pay the property tax, and the access was restricted. Every digital door was locking just like the one at home. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed every conversation from the past few months, every moment Brianna had whispered something to our parents, every receipt she had tucked away. By dawn, the truth was unbearable but clear. This wasn't about family tension. It was about money. She wanted control of the $640,000 my parents had saved over decades of work, the rental condo that brought in steady income, and the house that would eventually be worth more than $1 million. But what hurt most wasn't losing the house. I realized my parents believed her. They had looked at me, who had spent weekends fixing the roof with Dad and driving Mom to her doctor's appointments, and decided I was the problem. I lay there until the first light seeped through the thin curtains, my heart heavy but oddly steady. If Brianna thought she had won, she was wrong. I didn't have the power or the money she did, but I had something better, patience and a plan. I promised myself that night that I would never let her bury the truth. I would find a way to prove what she had done, not just to me but to them. So I began where every story of justice begins, not with anger, but with preparation. I opened my laptop, created a new folder, and titled it simply, Evidence. I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment in Logan Square, Chicago. It wasn't much: peeling paint in the hallway, a creaky floor, and the faint sound of the L train rumbling in the distance, but it was mine. I paid $1,450 a month for it, furnished with second-hand pieces I found through online listings. It had a narrow balcony that caught just enough sunlight to keep my rosemary plants alive. I spent my evenings there, watching the city lights flicker like quiet promises. For weeks after being thrown out, I barely spoke to my parents. Each time I tried to call, Brianna answered first, her tone syrupy and false. "They're busy, Maya," she'd say. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." I knew then that she was tightening her grip. My parents weren't cruel people. They were simply tired, aging, and too trusting of the child who spoke the loudest. But I wasn't going to be silent. I had lost my home once. I wouldn't lose my dignity next. So instead of fighting her openly, I began working quietly. I knew if I accused her too soon, she'd cover her tracks. A liar like Brianna thrived in chaos, but she panicked under quiet observation. Through a coworker, I found an attorney named Allison Reed. She worked out of a glass office on Wacker Drive, her manner calm and deliberate. Her hourly rate, $3.20, made me hesitate, but I sold a designer bag Brianna had once mocked me for owning and booked the consultation. Allison listened carefully as I told her everything: the sudden eviction, the changed locks, the frozen accounts. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "If you want to fight her, you'll need more than outrage. You'll need proof." That single word, proof, became my obsession. Allison explained what financial manipulation looks like on paper: sudden power of attorney transfers, changes in property deeds, odd withdrawals that don't match ordinary expenses. She advised me to document everything, even the smallest text or email. "She's clever," Allison warned, "but the truth leaves a paper trail." So I began to collect. I bought a small voice recorder for $58 and a compact scanner for $190. I set up a cloud folder with two-factor authentication and labeled it Project Sunlight. Every message, every screenshot, every conversation went there. I created a new email account that no one knew about. I even kept a handwritten log with times, dates, and summaries of every contact I had with my parents or Brianna. When I wasn't working at my design firm, I studied. I learned about elder financial abuse laws in Illinois, property fraud, and guardianship petitions. I watched hours of legal education videos on YouTube, pausing to jot notes about terms like constructive fraud and implied consent. I may not have had Brianna's financial degree, but I was learning faster than she ever imagined I could. Brianna, of course, couldn't resist showing off. She started sending group texts boasting about optimizing assets and restructuring family wealth. I responded with politeness, never hostility. "That's great, Brianna," I'd write. "You're doing so much for Mom and Dad." Her ego was a door she didn't realize was open. Each time she bragged, she revealed more than she intended. I backed up every word she sent. In one text, She mentioned a small property shift for tax purposes. I forwarded it to myself, timestamped. Later, my mother accidentally mentioned signing something for love and affection. That phrase made my stomach turn. It was legal language often used in property transfers that masked ownership changes. I began to suspect that Brianna had convinced them to sign over the house. Through Allison, I met Jacob Price, a forensic accountant who specialized in asset tracing. He wasn't flashy, gray suit, wire glasses, a voice that never rose above a murmur, but he saw numbers like a map. His retainer was steep, $2,800, but I used my savings and told him to start immediately. Within 2 weeks, Jacob showed me what looked like a spider's web. Money moving from my parents' joint account into a new account under Brianna's name, then disappearing into short-term investments and consulting fees. She's siphoning small amounts regularly, Jacob explained, pointing to a chart filled with red arrows. It's structured to look like casual transfers, but she's building a fund that's entirely hers. Each discovery made my anger harden into resolve. I wasn't just gathering evidence anymore, I was protecting what my parents had built their whole lives. I bought a thick binder and divided it into color-coded sections. Blue for property documents, green for banking records, red for health and safety, and yellow for communications. Every page had a date and a note. I stored one copy in my apartment and another in a safety deposit box downtown for $92 a year. If my apartment ever got broken into, I wanted a backup somewhere she couldn't touch. Still, collecting information wasn't easy. Brianna had isolated my parents, screening their calls and controlling their appointments. I had to get creative. I befriended Mrs. Delaney, the neighbor across the street, who still thought fondly of me. She began sending small updates, photos of moving trucks, contractors, deliveries. One evening, she texted me a picture of Brianna's car parked outside at midnight with a caption, "She's been having a lot of meetings lately." Each piece fits into the growing puzzle. But this work took its toll. Nights stretched long. I'd sit at my kitchen table, surrounded by papers, my computer humming softly while I highlighted lines in PDFs. Some nights I felt hollow, like I was fighting a ghost who always stayed one step ahead. Yet each morning I'd wake and remind myself that justice takes time. In April, something shifted. Brianna started slipping. She sent a voice note complaining that Dad was dragging his feet about paperwork. Her tone was sharp, frustrated, and careless. I replayed it 3 times and saved it. It was the first crack in her armor, a sign that her control wasn't as perfect as she thought. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "She's overconfident. Wait. Let her build the wall higher. Then push once." By summer, my binder was thick enough to feel like a weapon. Jacob's report was complete, Allison had prepared preliminary filings, and I had built a digital archive impossible to erase. The day I finished organizing it all, I stood on my balcony, breathing in the heavy July air, and whispered to myself, "When the truth comes, let it be loud." I didn't know when my parents would call. I only knew that they would. And when they did, I'd be ready. It was late March in Chicago, and the cold felt sharper than usual, the kind that cut through every layer of clothing and went straight to the bone. I had been up since dawn, sorting digital folders of emails and voice recordings, double-checking timestamps, and updating a spreadsheet that mapped every dollar Brianna had moved from our parents' accounts. The quiet hum of my laptop filled the room when a soft, uneven knock sounded on my door. When I opened it, I froze. My parents stood there, shivering under the yellow hallway light. My mother's face was pale and drawn, her eyes swollen from crying. She clutched a plastic grocery bag filled with a sweater, a photo album, and what looked like her medication. My father held a worn leather folder with the bank's logo on it, his hands trembling slightly. Their coats were thin, their expressions hollow. The smell of cold air and wet wool clung to them. My mother's voice cracked first. "She changed the locks, Maya," she whispered. "On us." I stepped aside quickly and helped them in. My mother sank onto the couch as if her knees might give out. My father stayed standing, gripping that folder as though it were the only solid thing left in his world. I boiled water and made tea, my mind racing. When I returned, My father laid the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were copies of bank statements, property documents, and a quitclaim deed I had never seen before. She said it was for our protection, he said quietly. Something about simplifying the estate. I felt a slow chill crawl up my spine as I scanned the papers. The deed transferred ownership of their house to Brianna for the sum of $1. The power of attorney form was dated 3 months earlier and bore shaky signatures that barely resembled my father's handwriting. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady, "do you remember signing this?" He looked down, ashamed. "She told me it was for tax paperwork. I didn't read it." My mother began to sob softly, her hands twisting the fabric of her sweater. "She said we were in debt, that you had borrowed money against the house. She said we'd lose everything unless we transferred it to her name temporarily." I sat beside her and wrapped my arm around her shoulders. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that this kind of manipulation was what Brianna excelled at. But my throat felt tight. All those months of silence, of pretending to believe Brianna's act, had led here, to my parents on my couch, homeless in the same city where they'd built their lives. "I'm so sorry," my mother said between tears. We believed her. She said you wanted to take the money for yourself. That hit harder than I expected. But I swallowed it and managed a small smile. "It doesn't matter what she said. You're here now, and we're going to fix this." My father looked at me then, really looked at me, and something shifted in his eyes. Hope, faint but alive. I told them everything. How I'd started collecting evidence the moment Brianna had kicked me out. How I'd met with an attorney, a forensic accountant, and built a case so airtight it could survive Brianna's lies. As I spoke, my parents just listened, the disbelief on their faces slowly giving way to something like relief. When I finished, my mother whispered, "You did all that?" "Yes," I said softly, "because I knew this day was coming." The next morning, we met Allison Reed at her office downtown. It was a sleek glass building overlooking the river, the kind of place Brianna would have bragged about walking into. Allison arrived early, professional as ever, her calm voice grounding us. I handed her the binder and the flash drive. She flipped through the pages, nodding as she read. "This is strong," she said finally. "We'll file for an emergency injunction today to stop any sale or transfer of the property. We'll also petition the court for temporary guardianship over your parents' financial matters." Jacob Price, the forensic accountant, joined us shortly after with printed charts in a leather folder. He showed us how $180,000 had been siphoned from my parents' savings into Brianna's personal account over 6 months. Some of it paid for a $12,500 diamond ring, another chunk covered lease payments for a luxury car, and the rest was tied to a loft apartment in Fulton Market, $6 for $100 a month. When my mother saw the documents, she gasped, That's my retirement money." Jacob nodded gravely. "We can trace it all. Every transaction, every timestamp." By the end of that meeting, Allison had filed the injunction, contacted the bank's fraud department, and arranged a meeting with the district attorney's office. The speed and precision with which she worked gave me a kind of quiet strength. For the first time in months, it felt like we weren't helpless anymore. That evening, I drove my parents past their old home. The sight of it made my mother grip my arm. New blinds covered the windows, and a delivery truck idled in the driveway. Workers unloaded boxes marked marble and wine fridge. It looked like Brianna was remodeling, using their money. My father stared at the house, his jaw tight. "She erased us," he murmured. I parked across the street, headlights off, and watched the warm glow spilling through the windows. A life stolen, lived without remorse. I could almost picture her inside, laughing, sipping wine, convinced she had won. But she hadn't. Not this time. Because while she was building her empire on deceit, I had been building my foundation on proof. Every lie she told was already documented. Every forged signature, every manipulated account, every cruel word was preserved in black and white. As the wind picked up, my mother turned to me, her voice trembling. "Do you think we'll ever get our home back?" I looked at the house, then at her, and said, "Yes." Because I won't stop until we do. That night, after dropping them at a hotel I paid for with my savings, I sat alone in my car outside my apartment. My phone buzzed. A message from Allison. It read, "Court hearing scheduled.
You've done well, Maya. Get some rest.
Tomorrow we begin." I smiled faintly. Tomorrow wasn't just another day. It was the beginning of justice. 2 weeks later, we walked into the Cook County Courthouse. I remember the air inside was heavy, the kind that makes you breathe slower. The hall smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, and my shoes echoed on the marble floor as if each step marked the distance between who I used to be and who I was now. I wore a navy suit I'd bought on clearance for $210, a small armor of confidence. My mother wore her best church dress, pale lavender with tiny pearl buttons, and my father clutched the table like a man holding on to the last railing of a sinking ship. Brianna arrived late, laughing as if this were brunch, not a court hearing. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she carried a designer handbag worth more than my rent. When she saw our parents, she put on a look of mock concern. "Mom, Dad," she said brightly, "this is all a misunderstanding. We can clear it up in minutes." Allison Reed, our attorney, stepped forward and said evenly, "Please take your seat." Her voice didn't waver once. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a tone that tolerated no performance, opened the proceedings. "We're here today to address claims of property fraud, financial exploitation, and coercion," she said. Her words hung in the air like a bell tolling. The prosecutor began by submitting the evidence I had spent months collecting: voice recordings, text messages, financial transfers, and the forged documents. Each item was numbered, labeled, and backed by authentication from Jacob Price, the forensic accountant. He sat beside us, calm as ever, flipping through pages with the precision of a surgeon. When the first recording played, Brianna's smile faltered. Her own voice filled the courtroom speakers. "Don't worry, by spring the house will be mine. They're so easy to manage when I play the daughter card." A murmur spread through the room. My mother gasped quietly, pressing her hands to her chest. Next came the screenshots, messages where Brianna bragged to a friend about moving money for efficiency, texts where she told a banker, "I'm the power of attorney, just push this through." Then a neighbor's phone video appeared on the screen, showing movers carrying out my parents' bed while my mother begged them to stop. The footage silenced everyone. Even the bailiff's eyes softened. When it was my turn to testify, I stood and told the truth as plainly as I could. I spoke about the day I was thrown out, the months I spent gathering proof, and how I didn't want money or revenge, just my parents' safety and their home back. My voice didn't shake. For the first time, I felt that the balance of power had shifted. Jacob then presented his findings. He used a laser pointer to highlight how Brianna had siphoned $180,000 from my parents' savings through layered accounts and fake consulting fees. Every red arrow on the chart represented her greed. Every number told a story of betrayal. Allison followed with a detailed analysis of the forged signatures, explaining that the notary stamp on the deed didn't belong to a licensed notary at all. It was copied and printed from an image file. Brianna tried to interrupt. "That's not true. They permitted me. They wanted me to handle their finances. Maya's twisting everything because she's jealous of me." The judge looked unimpressed. "Miss Collins, you'll have your turn to speak." When she finally did, her tone changed from arrogance to desperation. She claimed the recordings were taken out of context. She said she had only wanted to protect our parents from Maya's bad decisions. It was like watching a mass crumble piece by piece. Then came the moment that sealed her fate. The judge turned to my mother and asked gently, "Did you knowingly sign over your home to your daughter?" My mother lifted her chin. Her voice, though quiet, was clear. "No, Your Honor.
She told us it was a tax form."
I never would have signed away our home." My father nodded, tears sliding down his cheeks. "She guided our hands," he said. "We trusted her." The judge sat back, silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I've heard enough." The order was swift. The deed was voided. Title to the house returned to Laura and David Collins. The accounts in Brianna's name that contained stolen funds were frozen. A criminal investigation for elder abuse, fraud, and theft was officially opened. As the bailiff approached, Brianna's bravado broke. She stood frozen, disbelief etched across her face as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. She looked at me then, eyes wide, mascara streaking, and whispered, "You set me up." I met her gaze and said softly, "No, you set yourself up. I just kept the receipts." They led her out of the courtroom, her heels echoing down the corridor. The sound faded, and for the first time in over a year, I felt like I could breathe again. After the hearing, my parents and I sat together on a courthouse bench. My mother reached for my hand and squeezed it. "You saved us, Maya," she whispered. My father, who had been quiet most of the day, finally said, "You gave us back our home." In the following weeks, we repainted the house. The walls that once echoed with betrayal now smelled of fresh paint and lemon polish. We replaced the locks, hired a part-time caregiver, and set up financial safeguards so no one could ever deceive them again. Every detail, every light fixture, every framed photo felt like a restoration of peace. As for me, I decided to start fresh. I found a brick cottage in Oak Park listed for $520,000 and signed a lease-to-own agreement. I used my savings and a $15,000 grant from a victim support fund to cover the down payment and legal costs. On the day I moved in, I stood in the middle of my living room surrounded by unpacked boxes and sunlight streaming through the window. The space smelled of paint and hope. That evening, I cooked pasta, poured a glass of wine, and hung my grandmother's silver locket by the door. I traced its cool surface and thought about everything that had happened. The snow, the oranges rolling across the pavement, my parents' trembling hands, and the courtroom that finally gave us justice. Now, when I hold the key to my new home, I think of how it fits perfectly in my hand, solid, warm, earned. I learned something through all of this. Love is not blind. It's observant. It protects, it proves, it endures. I carried that proof to court and brought my parents home. And in doing so, I finally found my own.